The Nazis didn't see captured Soviet female spies as prisoners of war. They saw them as illegal fighters, which meant they believed they could do whatever they wanted to them. And in many cases, they did. From the moment of capture, these women entered a system where there were no limits and no protection. What they went through is one of the darkest and most uncomfortable truths of the war. It started in the cold, chaotic weeks after Operation Barbarossa, when German forces were pushing hard toward Moscow and the Soviet leadership was running out of time. Villages west of the capital were already occupied, and German units were using local homes, barns, and storage buildings to survive the brutal Russian winter. Soviet command responded with a harsh strategy. Small sabotage units were sent behind enemy lines with orders to destroy anything that could help German troops hold their ground. These missions were dangerous from the start because the fighters were lightly equipped, often poorly trained, and operating alone or in very small groups, with no real backup if something went wrong. One of the people chosen for this kind of mission was Zoya Kozmodemyanskaya, an 18-year-old from a rural background who had volunteered for service not long after the invasion began. She became part of a reconnaissance and sabotage group operating under Soviet military intelligence. Her training was short and intense, focusing on basic survival, moving unseen, and carrying out orders without hesitation. There was no long preparation because the front was collapsing too fast, so young recruits like her were sent out quickly, sometimes within weeks. In late November 1941, her group was sent to the village of Petrishova, about 100 kilometers west of Moscow. The order was to burn buildings being used by German troops, so they would be forced into the open in freezing temperatures. Zoya managed to set fire to several structures, but on her second attempt, local villagers, either out of fear or cooperation with the Germans, raised the alarm. German soldiers quickly surrounded the area, and she was captured after a short chase. From that moment, everything changed. She was no longer a soldier on a mission. She became a prisoner in a system that did not recognize her as a lawful combatant. She was taken to a local building and interrogated almost immediately. The Germans demanded information, including names of her commanders, details about her unit, locations of other sabotage teams operating in the area. She gave them nothing. What followed was meant to force her to talk. She was beaten and kept in freezing conditions without proper clothing, a method often used to weaken prisoners physically and mentally. Witness accounts from villagers later described how she was brought outside, visibly injured, and forced to stand in the cold for long periods. At one point, she was reportedly paraded through the village, not just as punishment, but as a warning. Even then, she refused to cooperate. On November 29, 1941, she was executed in the village square. The execution was public, carried out in front of locals to spread fear and discourage resistance. The Germans wanted to make an example out of her, to show that sabotage would be crushed without hesitation. But the result didn't go the way they expected. Instead of disappearing into silence, her story spread. Soviet newspapers picked it up, and she was later declared a hero of the Soviet Union, becoming one of the first widely known female figures of resistance during the war. By 1942, the war had moved deeper into Soviet land, and places like Belarus became central to the hidden fight against German occupation. The region's thick forests and scattered villages made it ideal for partisan warfare. Soviet resistance groups grew quickly there, and unlike the earlier months of the war, these were no longer small, isolated teams. They became organized networks with supply lines, communication systems, and local support. Women played a huge role in keeping these networks alive, because they could move through towns and cities with less attention, carrying messages, gathering intelligence, and helping coordinate attacks without immediately raising suspicion. One of the key figures working inside this system was Maria Osipova, based in Minsk, which was under German occupation. She wasn't just passing information. She was helping build and manage underground resistance from inside a controlled city, which was extremely risky. She worked with other operatives to organize safe houses, move weapons, and connect different groups that otherwise would have been cut off from each other. Women like her became the backbone of these operations, not because they were safer, but because the entire network depended on people who could move quietly and keep things running. But by early 1942, the Germans had started to understand how these networks worked, and they began adapting their response. Units from the Gestapo and other forces launched systematic operations to break resistance groups apart. They used informants, sometimes local, who were forced or bribed into cooperating, and they tracked patterns of movement, unusual behavior, and intercepted communications when possible. Once they identified a network, they moved quickly to dismantle it. In Minsk, several underground cells were exposed. Arrests happened suddenly, often in the middle of the night, and entire groups were taken at once. Among those captured were many women, including couriers who carried messages between cells, radio operators who maintained contact with Soviet command, and ordinary civilians who had simply helped partisans with food or shelter. To the Germans, all of them were part of the same threat. Once arrested, they were interrogated immediately. The Germans already assumed they were involved. The goal was to extract as much information as possible before moving on to the next target. Every captured person became a starting point for finding others. If one name came up, that led to another arrest, and then another. It was a chain reaction designed to collapse entire networks from the inside. The interrogations were intense and often violent because time mattered. The Germans knew that resistance groups could relocate quickly, so they pushed hard for immediate answers. Women who worked as couriers or radio operators were especially valuable because they often knew multiple contacts and routes. Some broke under pressure, giving away information that led to more arrests. Others held out, refusing to speak despite what they faced. For those who refused, the outcome was usually final. Many were executed or disappeared into prisons without any official record. Families often never found out what happened. There were no trials in most cases, no formal process, just a system designed to eliminate resistance as efficiently as possible. Later in 1942, as the fighting spread deeper into occupied Soviet territory, another name started to stand out inside the underground resistance: Vera Korusaya. She was not new to this kind of work. Even before the German invasion, she had already been involved in political and underground activities, which meant she understood how to organize people, pass information quietly, and operate under pressure. When German forces took control of Belarus in 1941, she didn't flee or step back. She went underground almost immediately and began helping rebuild resistance networks from scratch. She was operating in the city of Vitebsk, which had become a key point for both German military involvement and Soviet resistance activity. She was organizing sabotage operations, helping coordinate partisan groups in nearby forests, and maintaining communication between different cells that had to stay hidden from German patrols and informants. This kind of work required constant movement, careful planning, and complete trust in the people around her, because one mistake could expose the entire network. At the same time, German control in the region was becoming more aggressive and more organized. Units connected to the Gestapo and other security forces were actively hunting resistance members using intelligence, surveillance, and informants. Cities like Vitebsk were under constant watch, and anyone suspected of unusual activity could be followed, questioned, or arrested without warning. In September 1942, during one of these crackdowns, Korusaya was arrested. The exact details of how she was identified are still unclear, but it likely involved a combination of informants and surveillance, which had become common by that point in the war. Once she was in custody, the Germans quickly realized who they had captured. She was taken to prison and interrogated repeatedly. For high-value prisoners like her, interrogation was not a one-time event. It happened over days, sometimes weeks, with constant pressure to give up names, locations, and operational details. German forces understood that breaking someone like her could lead to dozens of arrests. That is why the pressure was so intense. Despite that, she refused to cooperate. Records and later accounts show that she did not provide the information they were looking for, even under extreme conditions. This kind of resistance came at a cost. The longer someone held out, the harsher the treatment usually became. But in cases like hers, where the prisoner remained silent, the outcome was often decided quickly. Not long after her arrest, she was executed. Her death made something very clear about how this war was being fought behind the front lines. It didn't matter if someone was young or experienced, a courier or a leader. Once captured, especially by forces like the Gestapo, the chances of survival were extremely low. What mattered to the Germans was control. Anyone who threatened that control, especially someone with knowledge and connections, was removed. And as 1942 moved forward into 1943, this pattern did not slow down. By then, the hidden war behind German lines had become more advanced and more dangerous on both sides. Soviet partisan groups were no longer operating in isolation. They were connected through radio communication, sending updates about German troop movements, coordinating attacks, and receiving instructions from Soviet command. Radios became one of the most important tools in this entire system because they allowed resistance groups to act as part of a larger strategy, instead of just local fighters. But this advantage came with a serious risk. German counterintelligence units had developed radio detection technology that could track where signals were coming from. These units, often called Funkabwehr, used mobile equipment to scan for transmissions. Once a signal was detected, they could narrow down the location step by step. It wasn't always instant, but if a radio operator stayed active too long or transmitted too often, their position could be identified. After that, German forces would move in quickly, sometimes surrounding entire areas before making arrests. This turned radio operators into some of the most hunted people in occupied territory. They were not just carrying messages, they were the link between local resistance and Soviet command, which made them extremely valuable targets. Many of these operators were women because they had already been working as couriers and intelligence gatherers, so they were trusted with this responsibility. One network connected to this kind of activity involved Yelena Mazanik, who played a role in one of the most high-profile assassinations in occupied Belarus. In September 1943, she was involved in the operation that killed Wilhelm Kuba, the German administrator of the region. The attack took place in Minsk, inside Kuba's own residence, where a bomb was planted under his bed. The operation succeeded. Kuba was killed instantly. From the Soviet side, this was a major victory. It showed that even high-ranking German officials were not safe. But for the people on the ground in occupied territory, especially those connected to resistance networks, it triggered something immediate and brutal. The German response came fast. Security forces launched large-scale reprisals across Minsk and surrounding areas. Dozens of people were arrested within days based on suspicion, connections, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Many of those taken were women who had roles in the underground network. Captured individuals were interrogated aggressively because the Germans wanted to understand exactly how the assassination had been carried out. They needed to know who planned it, who helped, and whether more attacks were coming. Women involved in these networks were treated the same as men when it came to punishment, but in many cases, they faced even harsher treatment during interrogation, especially if they were believed to have key information. Being a radio operator, a courier, or someone connected to a major operation like the assassination of Kuba made them especially valuable targets. By this point in the war, the pattern was clear. The more effective the resistance became, the more intense the German response grew. By 1944, the direction of the war had started to change. The Soviet Red Army was pushing west after major turning points like Stalingrad and Kursk, and German forces were being forced to retreat from large parts of occupied territory. But instead of simply pulling back, the Germans tried to erase what they were leaving behind. Prisons were emptied, resistance suspects were rounded up in large numbers, and transport trains were organized to move prisoners deeper into Germany. Among those taken were Soviet women who'd been captured over the past 2 years as spies, couriers, radio operators, or simply accused of helping partisans. These transports were not organized for safety or comfort. Prisoners were packed into freight cars, often without enough food, water, or space to sit properly. The journeys could take days, sometimes longer, and many arrived already weak or sick before even reaching their destination. One of the main places they were sent was Ravensbrück concentration camp, located about 90 kilometers north of Berlin. It was the largest concentration camp built specifically for women, and by 1944, it had become overcrowded far beyond what it was designed to handle. Ravensbrück had been operating since 1939, but in the final years of the war, conditions had become so much worse. Tens of thousands of women from across Europe were held there, including political prisoners, resistance fighters, and those labeled as asocial or undesirable. Soviet prisoners, especially those suspected of partisan activity or espionage, were placed at the very bottom of the camp hierarchy. This mattered because the camp operated on a system where some prisoners received slightly better treatment than others. Being at the bottom meant less food, harder labor, and a much higher risk of punishment or death. When Soviet women arrived, they had already gone through arrest, interrogation, and often physical abuse. But Ravensbrück was not a place where things stabilized. It was where suffering continued in a more systematic way. Prisoners were registered, given numbers, and stripped of personal identity. Many were assigned immediately to forced labor. This included working in nearby industrial facilities connected to German companies, building parts for weapons, assembling equipment, or doing heavy manual labor like construction and digging. The work days were long, and failure to meet quotas could result in beatings or worse. Food was barely enough to survive. Daily rations often consisted of thin soup and small portions of bread, which led to rapid weight loss and weakness. Disease spread easily because the barracks were overcrowded and sanitation was poor. Illnesses like typhus became common, and medical care was almost non-existent for most prisoners. Those who became too weak to work were often selected for execution or left to die from neglect. Some women in Ravensbrück were also subjected to medical experiments. These were carried out by German doctors who used prisoners as test subjects without consent. In many cases, women were deliberately injured or infected to study wound treatment or disease progression. Soviet prisoners were among those selected, especially because they were considered expendable by camp authorities. Despite all of this, small acts of resistance still existed inside the camp. Women shared food when they could, helped hide those who were sick, and supported each other in ways that made survival slightly more possible. These actions didn't change the system, but they showed that even in a place designed to break people completely, some refused to give up their humanity. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was falling apart from both sides. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, while Allied armies were moving in from the west. Inside Germany, there was confusion, fear, and a growing realization that the war was lost. Camps like Ravensbrück were directly in the path of the advancing Red Army, and the SS guards knew it. As a result, the situation inside the camp became chaotic. Orders were given to evacuate prisoners, destroy records, and remove evidence of what had been happening. Many prisoners were forced onto what later became known as death marches, where they were made to walk long distances in freezing conditions with little food or rest. Those who could not keep up were often shot or left behind. At the same time, parts of the camp were still functioning, with thousands of prisoners left behind in overcrowded and worsening conditions. Guards were less organized, supplies were running out, and discipline inside the camp was breaking down. Some guards fled before Soviet troops arrived, while others stayed until the last moment. When Soviet forces finally reached Ravensbrück concentration camp in late April 1945, what they found was shocking, even for soldiers who had already seen years of war. Thousands of women were still alive, but in extremely weak and sick conditions. Many were suffering from starvation, disease, and untreated injuries. The camp itself showed clear signs of neglect and rushed abandonment, with records destroyed and facilities left in disarray. Among the survivors were Soviet women who had been captured years earlier while working as spies, partisans, or resistance helpers. Some had been there since 1943 or 1944, meaning they had survived long periods of forced labor, poor conditions, and constant fear. They had gone through arrest, interrogation, transport, imprisonment, and daily survival inside one of the harshest camps in the system. But liberation didn't mean everything was suddenly over. Many survivors were too weak to recover quickly. Medical teams had to deal with severe malnutrition, disease outbreaks, and psychological trauma. For Soviet women in particular, there was another layer waiting for them once they returned home. The Soviet system often viewed former prisoners with suspicion, especially those who had spent long periods in German custody. Some were questioned again, investigated, or treated as potential collaborators regardless of what they had actually endured. Because of this, many survivors stayed silent for decades. Their experiences were not widely shared or studied. Their stories remained mostly hidden.